Talked a little bit about anatomy and physiology, and we've talked about some of the terminology of the horse's feet. We want to talk a little bit about how we're going to manage all this and maintain soundness for the long term of our horses. So there's two basic parts to this. One is some trimming principles, and then various hoof problems and diseases that we commonly see, at least in my practice of shoeing horses, some of the things that we see and how we deal with those. Here's a picture of a nice pair of feet. When you look at these feet, they're fairly symmetrical. They're pretty well paired. One side is about like the other. Later we're going to see a rear view of these feet and actually see that there are some differences. But from the front, this is pretty much what we like to see. Although there's an indentation that occurs about halfway back on the inside or the medial side of the foot. These are pretty healthy feet. This horse is very sound. Because it's wintertime, we decided to pull the shoes on this horse and trim the feet and round them up. And that's probably one of the main things that we do that's different about trimming feet and leaving them to go barefoot versus putting shoes on them, is we leave a little more length of foot and we really round the edges of the foot so that they don't chip up. They hold together much better, and especially because of the uneven ground that we have this time of year, it's really important to round those feet up so that they don't chip up and break up. But pretty nice even pair of feet, what we like to shoot for. Here's a picture of a horse's foot that hasn't been trimmed. You can see that the heels of the foot, the end points of the heels, or the buttress of the heels as we like to refer to them as, have actually grown forward of where the back of the frog is. We'd like to see those heels back closer to the back of the frog. That's an indication that we've removed the right amount of heel. As far as the toe of the foot, again, we want that wall to be just slightly longer than the sole, and we want the sole to be nice and clean and paired out. And the way that we tell that we've taken the right amount of sole is it'll be clear and glossy and not have any flaky texture to it. But this is just a pretty typical barefoot horse. It's a mare that does just fine to go barefoot. She really doesn't need shoes. She's ridden in an environment that's not rocky, not uneven ground, and she does quite well. Obviously, it's been a little while since she's been trimmed. But now here's a picture of after that same foot is trimmed, and you can see the end points of the heel are closer to the back of the frog. The sole has just been paired out to where it's just glossy, and the hoof wall's been left slightly longer than the sole at the toe of the foot. So I think it's important to have a good idea of what we want to accomplish before we pull any tools out of the bag. Okay, and so in order to understand what we're trying to strive for, here's a picture that shows if you were to drop a plumb line down through the center of the foot, where it came out the bottom as far as the center of gravity of the foot is about 3/8 to 1/2 inch behind the point of the trimmed frog. What we'd like to see ideally is about the same amount of hoof distance on either side of that point, and the same thing both front and behind it. Now, because this is a hind foot, this happens to be a halfling or pony, they tend to bear more weight on the outside of their feet because their hips are built real wide. And so you're not going to have a perfectly symmetrical foot, but if we strive for that, we're going to be much more apt to achieve symmetry than if we just allow the foot to get flared out. You can see in the left side of the screen, back in the quarter of the foot, there's still some flaring going on there. We could dress some more of that part of the foot off and then round the foot up good, because that's still wider on the left side of the picture than it is on the right side. But the distance from the toe of the foot to the center of gravity, and the center of gravity back to the back part of the frog, which is about where the heels end, that's a pretty good distance, pretty equal distance, what we like to strive for. Okay, so here's a picture of the opposite foot on this horse, and again you can see that that horse hasn't been bearing weight very evenly. The frog has been grown and laid over to one side. This is not an excessive amount of growth. These horses just have healthy feet. They grow real well. Happens to be summertime for this horse that lives in New Mexico. And it really just needs to be trimmed up and cleaned up at this point. But you can see how the foot trimmed, even though it's probably been 8 or 9 weeks since this horse was last trimmed, it's still fairly symmetrical in its shape, and we achieve that by balancing the foot each time we trim it. And probably the real test is that when we come back 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks later, whatever's the appropriate schedule for that horse, that foot is still relatively symmetrical. That's probably one of the best indicators we have of how well we did our job the last time. Okay, so here's a picture of the same untrimmed foot, and then there's a picture of the trimmed foot next to it. You can see how the frog has been cleaned up on either side. The center of the frog, or the sulcus we like to call it, has been trimmed out. That's one of the things I notice that sometimes we don't do enough of. But if you think back to the pictures when the feet were dissected that we showed earlier, the center of that frog really was quite opened up, at least on the sensitive frog, and so that's an indication of how we should trim the insensitive frog on the bottom of the foot. The growth where the frog behind the heels of the foot turn into the periopal has been cleaned up. The foot has maintained its symmetry. The sole has been pared out to where it's just glossy, and then the hoof wall's been trimmed down to where almost the same length as the sole but left slightly longer. So we have a nice symmetrical foot that's clean but hasn't been over